Welcome to Season 3 of the Do No Harm podcast, where we discuss the battle to keep politics out of medicine. Hosted by Ian Kingsbury, Do No Harm's Director of Research, and Scott Centorino, Vice President of Policy and Programs.
Welcome back to the Do No Harm podcast, where we defend the core values of medical practice every week. Hosted by myself, Ian Kingsbury, Do No Harm's Director of Research, and Scott Centorino, VP of Policy and Programs. Tune in as we tackle issues such as how to combat DEI in medicine and so-called gender-affirming care, all to protect patients and ensure healthcare focuses on science and solutions, not politics. How's it going, Scott?
Thanks. Yeah, Ian, we've got a good guest today. He's not only a wise man, but a handsome man. Dr. Stanley Goldfarb has a distinguished career a lot of our listeners are familiar with. He has a distinguished background in academic medicine as a professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Throughout his career, he has made significant research contributions, particularly in kidney disease, with funding from the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Goldfarb has authored over 100 articles in esteemed medical journals and held vital roles on editorial boards. Additionally, he has influenced medical education as Associate Dean for Curriculum. But he finally met his full potential, despite that rough start to his professional career, finally met his full potential in founding and becoming board chairman at Do No Harm, at which both Ian and I work, which is obviously exciting for us. So we will welcome in Dr. Goldfarb to the podcast, and really looking forward to talking with you.
Well, it's great to be with you, gentlemen, and it's an honor for me. Thank you.
Awesome. So we could go in any number of different directions, but why don't we start at the beginning, Dr. Goldfarb? We'll start with a big picture question, and it's one that a lot of listeners will have strong opinions about. That's probably what brought them here in the first place. But let's do a little bit of table setting. Political activism in medicine. What are the downsides of it? I mean, other professions are allowed and often do get involved in politics. Why is medicine special? What are the dangers that are particularly attendant to medicine when politics gets involved?
That's a very good question. Let me give you an example of the issue. So when I was at Penn, we had a course, I believe it's still there, called doctoring, where we taught students how to communicate with patients, sometimes difficult patients. And one of the issues was, what if a patient comes in with a tattoo of a swastika on their arm? How do you deal with that? And the point was, physicians just need to rise above that. And I think we see that with the Israeli physicians that treat terrorists after they try to blow up their fellow citizens, and then they'll take them into the emergency room and do all they can to keep them alive and treat their wounds. But what if it goes the other way? What if a patient comes in and the physician has their LGBTQ2+ pin on? They have their they hate Trump button on their jacket. What is that going to do to the relationship between the physician and the patient? And that's where we come to the problem, because the essence of having a good relationship is having trust. And if you have trust in your physician, and anybody who's visited a physician knows this, if you trust that individual, then when they recommend a treatment that you're not sure about, you'll go ahead and pursue it because you have trust. And if this activism gets out of hand, and I think it's on its way to getting out of hand, then that trust is going to be undermined. And that doesn't mean that physicians can't have their own political ideas, but there's a place and a time for everything. And the place and the time for their political ideas is not in the physician's office. It's not at work. It's as citizens, where they can march to the State House with their white coats on and say what they want. That's their business. But understand that that doesn't belong in the physician's interaction with their patients. And I even think that marching to the State House as a group will tend to undermine the view of that the profession is held in by patients. So, because again, we're a very polarized country, and there's a lot of tribalism that's going on. And medicine ought to be a place that's spared from all that.
Stan, I'm with you on the downsides of them really sort of donning their white coats and their medical identity to engage in political activism. I remember, this was, I guess, several weeks or several months into the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when everyone in the healthcare establishment was telling people stay at home, and then all of a sudden they were out in the streets and encouraging other people to come out in the streets in massive crowds to participate in these political protests. I remember just saying to my wife at the time, that this is it. No one's gonna abide by these public health orders anymore. They've exposed themselves here. It's a real problem. But I guess one of my other big concerns about this is, I'll date myself a little bit here, but where's the beef? You see the AMA and the AAMC really encouraging doctors and medical schools to infuse activism into their practice and their teaching, to constantly be learning about and talking about climate change, for example. Is there any evidence whatsoever that this is actually going to improve patient care?
No, of course not. There's no evidence that it will improve patient care. And one of the problems is that, there's no particular reason why physicians should have any particular expertise, knowledge, understanding of any of these issues compared to anybody else. So to sort of drape themselves in this aura of expertise because of their medical knowledge and use that aura to suggest to people expertise in how we should organize energy activities in society, whether, clouds are going to influence the global warming or not. I mean, these are questions that they have absolutely no expertise in, no experience in. And and on top of which is the fact that when it comes to the medical school curriculum, it takes valuable hours away from things that they should be studying. And, I know for a fact that when students finish their basic science training and get into some of the clinical rotations, many of the clinicians are very frustrated with how little they seem to know. They have to start to learn things they should have learned the first time through, which speaks to the lack of, I think, rigor in the medical curriculum. And what the AMA does and the double AMC, and they're pushing all these social agendas, there's absolutely no evidence that that's going to be beneficial. Their theory is that social conditions actually produce disease, as opposed to the notion, I think it's the correct notion, is that social conditions reflect behavioral characteristics that in themselves may predispose individuals to disease, particularly in the setting of increased genetic risk factors and other issues. So just because you live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of violence doesn't mean you're going to get diabetes. But if you live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of violence and you go ahead and allow yourself to gain too much weight or not visit a physician on some regularity to make sure that you're not developing prediabetes that could be dealt with some medications, you're likely to get diabetes. So I think this is a very wrong-headed approach that they've taken. But again, there are reasons for it, because we're in the middle of a zeitgeist of this kind of social activism in lots of spheres of life, and medicine has not been immune from it.
This question of social condition and disease, one thing that really should have got their attention was a study that came out a few months ago where it was an experiment involving universal basic income. I don't know if you saw this, but
Yeah.
An experiment, so causal interpretation of results. And they saw that when they gave people, I think it was maybe $1,000 extra per month in income, that there was no effect whatsoever on their health.
Yeah, I think what we tend to see is that there certainly are disparities in health outcomes for minority communities. When you try to get into the databases that are used to do these analyses, you find that you can explain a lot of it, but you can't explain all of it. So instead of saying, well, we can't explain part of it, we don't know what it's due to, it could be due to patient behaviors that we're not measuring, the decision has been made it's due to racism. It's due to the way physicians are treating these patients, even though there's no particular evidence for that. So it's this absence of data has deemed to be evidence of racism. And, it's foolish. And the real problem is it's not going to benefit anyone. We're going to waste a lot of time and money on solutions that are going to fail because there's no evidence that they would succeed.
Dr. Goldfarb, I'm imagining a listener right now who is with you, and the listener is thinking, yeah, it can be offensive for this assumption to be applied to all healthcare providers that I'm somehow beyond redemption and I need to be trained to see people in a different way. And I could see people even agreeing with everything you're saying about it being a waste of time in medical education. But I bet there are some listeners out there that are thinking, aren't we being just a little bit dramatic here? That what is the real cost of this? Let's say somebody has to undergo a couple hours of training in medical school. In the grand scheme of medical education, which, as you know, goes on for years and years, what are a few hours here and there? And if somebody happens to be overly sensitive to the needs of certain minority patients, what's the real cost there? Maybe you can answer that skeptical listener who's with you on the merits, but is not necessarily sold on how dangerous this is.
Well, it's a question of the tail of a normal distribution, if you will. So, it's okay most of the time. It won't matter, but occasionally it will matter. And if you're the person whose physician lacks knowledge in a particular area because they just haven't spent the time and nor have had the interest in a particular issue, then you're going to suffer from it. And there are a lot of medical mistakes. The government has shown that something like 98,000 people a year die, which they attribute to medical errors. And that's a real phenomenon. And a physician's knowledge and expertise is a function of how well their patients are going to do. So I know it's at the margins at this point, but the margins are really important. We have a recent study from the American Board of Internal Medicine that showed that those who do the best on the certifying exam to get board certified in internal medicine have the best patient outcomes in terms of mortality and readmissions to the hospital. This is the first time we have a link between the exam performance, which indicates knowledge, really. And these are very good exams. And those are exams that are designed to show, whether someone really has great expertise. And the more expertise the doctor has, the better their patients do. We also know from a study in Norway where patients have been assigned randomly to cohorts of primary care physicians. That's the way the healthcare system works. And looking at the outcomes of different randomly assigned groups of patients, there are real differences between one doctor and another. And again, the evidence is that doctors' capability is an important component of patients' outcomes. So I think it is at the margins. I don't dispute that, but the margins are important. I would also say that I certainly agree with the need for outreach, but outreach can be done on the basis of economic conditions. It can be done on the basis of availability of services in a community. It doesn't have to be done on a racial basis. And if we get the racism out of the whole thing and just say, look, there are communities that don't have enough access to physicians. What can we do to improve that? That's fine. But don't say, well, we're going to make sure the Black people in a certain community or the Hispanic people in a certain community get better care than everybody else because of historical problems. So I'm all for outreach, but I do maintain that at the margins, it's really important that we not waste a lot of time. And again, if it were only an hour in medical school, I'd say, fine. I agree. It's about 2 or 3 hours of lectures that would accomplish all you need to accomplish to identify what some of the social issues are that patients have to face. But it goes on for 4 years, for example, at Penn. It's more than an hour or two. It's many hours. And it takes the students' effort. It takes their time. It takes their focus. And it takes them away from what they really should be doing, which is learning how to treat sick people.
Stan, earlier you made a comment about how it's just not possible or realistic for doctors to become experts in climate change. Looking beyond climate change, obviously a lot of the social activism touches upon issues of race, and a lot of the knowledge that they're going to be consuming on this topic comes from peer-reviewed studies talking about the supposedly systemic effects of racism in healthcare and similar topics. But to read those studies, you do need to have some sophistication in terms of, reading all the fancy Greek letters and the methodology contained in those studies. Are doctors trained in a way that they can even make sense of what those studies say? Or is it more likely that they would simply have to accept the results in good faith?
Yeah, no, I think the latter is the case. We try to uh, instill a real command of biostatistics and epidemiology into medical students. They really don't want it because remember, the students that are being selected more and more, they're being selected for their interest in these social issues and not for their interest in hard science. It's almost like it's an afterthought. Oh yeah, they were good in organic chemistry, but they spent 3 months working on some sort of mission to some obscure place to treat people. That's wonderful. I'm glad they show their humanity in that way. But when they come back here and have to take care of sick people, that really doesn't matter that much. So I think that's right. I think there's been a real scarce dearth of real basic knowledge in some of these issues that you mentioned. Of course, that's why you get paid the big bucks, because you're able to take these studies and evaluate them, and really provide that information. And it's fair to use experts to do that. But as we saw in the COVID pandemic, when individuals didn't have a real command over biostatistics and epidemiology, they read studies, they accepted things at face value, they weren't able to think hard about what they were doing. They probably didn't have the curiosity that you have when you really understand things a lot better. And it's a real problem. And I think that's one example of how the hours in medical school could be better served by focusing much more on these issues of reading the literature, understanding the literature in medicine, and being able to, criticize it when it needs criticism and accepting it when it needs acceptance.
So to put a fine point on it, really, we're talking about indoctrination in those issues, not teaching, because they can't even, unfortunately, a lot of them probably just aren't trained to interrogate it, is what it sounds like.
No, they're not at all. They're not at all. I wouldn't say not at all. I mean, we had a 1-week course. We tried to infuse it into some of the clinical courses. The students didn't want it. And again, we have the students, getting more and more control over what they're learning, which I think is part of the problem. The popularity, the need for popularity in medical school, because that's the way professors are judged, is, a real part of the problem, which I guess we could get into.
If you're listening to the Do No Harm podcast, odds are you're concerned about the steady creep of DEI and identity politics in medical institutions nationwide. The best way to fight back is by becoming a free member of Do No Harm. We have more than 11,000 members nationwide, from physicians to nurses to folks in academia and concerned parents. Membership is free. Join us at donoharmmedicine.org/become a member.
Maybe I can ask a question that will hopefully be more interesting than it sounds at first. The basic question is why? We're talking about DEI being so saturated in the curriculum in just about everywhere, every medical institution, but obviously universities in particular. I can think of two general explanations. One is they actually believe it, that they think that this is out of a sense of altruism. They think that this is something that's important to the mission of medical schools. And then another possible explanation would be in the broader zeitgeist, as you said, they are just trying to keep up with the Joneses, and they're incorporating this material as a way to protect themselves from a broader cultural movement, or at least the enemies of that movement. And so I'm reminded of, you may be familiar with this, I think the historian's name was Stephen Kotkin, who wrote a whole book on the Soviet Union, and somebody asked him what surprised him when he actually went through all of the records of the Soviet Union and all the confidential private meeting minutes and all that. And he said, what surprised me was they were communist. These people weren't pretending to be communist. They actually believed this stuff, even in communications that were private. And so I'm curious, having been in this world for so long, to what degree do you think the folks actually incorporating this curriculum, this ideology, actually believe it? And what proportion of it do you think is because they're just trying to keep up with the Joneses?
Yeah, I would just mention about Stephen Kotkin. It was actually my son's thesis advisor in college. But I think what the Russians did after the fall of the Soviet Union suggested they really didn't believe in communism. They all became oligarchs. And so, it's hard to say. This is a fascinating question. We've put it down as saying that, we've had a whole generation of people that have started to see the world in this duality of the oppressed and the oppressor. And that once you've decided that a group of people, group of patients, a community is oppressed, like the minority community, that they seem to try to exalt, then they can do no wrong, and no problems are due to their own behaviors. It's all due to your oppression of them. But then the question is, well, how do you get to that position? Why does that position occur? What human trait leads one to decide that you're going to divide the world this way? And I've sort of been interested in a recent idea that I've encountered, that this is all about envy. So Jay Green talked a lot about this in his previous podcast, and I was hoping to be able to link to that one in this, because he gave a beautiful discussion about envy and its role in anti-Semitism, and envy in the station that many Jewish individuals have been able to achieve. But I think you can broaden out this idea more, in that this idea of envy is a big motivator, at least for the Black intellectuals and others who have really been pushing hard about this issue in medical school. And the envy there is, in the past, the leaders of academic medicine, for example, were individuals who were great scientists. You didn't get to be a leader unless you were a great scientist. And now that's not the case. The leaders are people, they may be good clinicians, but often they're people from the minority community. They envied the power that those individuals had. And it's a very human trait, unfortunately, for some people to be envious. And I think that has generated a lot of the social activism among the Black community. I must say, just very simply, they weren't the ones who were running institutions. They wanted to run institutions. They envied those who ran institutions. So they're doing all they can to gather that power. One example in my field has been this issue that I've tried to push about the way we measure kidney function. And it was a bunch of young Black activists who decided they wanted to change things, and they became very prominent because they pushed an issue that really had no real validity to it. The other side of the coin is what happens to people that are being envied. And it turns out that there's a fairly robust social science view that fear of being envied is a motivator for people. It generates guilt when you think people are envying my position. I feel really guilty about it. And I think if you go back in the history of this whole movement of diversity, equity, and inclusion in medical education, for example, you find that there were some very prominent people who felt very guilty about what they saw as an unfair situation. And they came up with a solution. The solution they came up with is to allow envy to work its way through. People were envious, and okay, we're going to give them what they want. What they should have sought, and which I think is the right answer, is people should try to emulate the great leaders of the past, the great scientists. If you want to rise up, okay, here's the model that you should pursue. We shouldn't do away with your testing requirements to get you into medical school. Rather, we should get you so you perform better on the tests. We shouldn't do away with the requirements for, high grades in college, but we should urge you and help you achieve higher grades, and then you'll deserve these rewards, if you will. So I think that's been a big part of things, and I think we need to really recognize it. And there are some people that are terribly envious, and really it becomes really malice almost that they manifest. But other people, I think this is a very basic thing, and I think we need to call it out. We need to say to people, no, you're not being treated unfairly. You want something that you haven't had, and you want to get it. Well, go ahead and get it, earn it. Don't have it given to you. And I think if you had Black intellectuals on the program like Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter and Coleman Hughes, this is what they'd say. They'd say, earn it. Don't have it given to you, but earn it. And I think that's driven, a lot of the thinking that's gone on in medical education, that they feel guilty about what happened 120 years ago, 150 years ago, and they've decided to make up for it. No one has a right to be a doctor. We're not in a reparations business in medical education. It's true that Blacks were excluded from this career for many years, but this current generation is not being excluded. This current generation, if they're qualified, even less qualified than others, they're getting their opportunities. Someone's called what's gone on sort of civil rights reenactors of civil rights era, and they were they didn't have an opportunity to be leaders like Bayard Rustin and Justice Marshall and Martin Luther King, and now they're getting their chance by pushing an agenda that really doesn't serve the American people and doesn't serve the Black community, because it undermines whatever achievements that Black individuals have been able to reach.
It's sort of a dog catches car moment, I think, right? And you see a similar phenomenon within the transgender world as well, where they're using the language of civil rights to talk about mutilating and sterilizing young children. But I think part of the problem is that the battle for gay rights, or whatever you want to call it, was won. We have gay marriage, and it's tends to be broadly accepted within society. So unfortunately, for a lot of these people, there's never a final victory. It's just on to the next thing. But sometimes the next thing is really sort of evil. Stan, what needs to happen for an organization like the AAMC or the AMA to really disengage from this stuff? It looks like it's not going to happen on their own volition. So is there something that can force them to just do the right thing?
Well, that's a tough one. I think this whole initiative in medicine to have diversity, equity, and inclusion be a focus of medical education and medical care and the way that medical systems are organized. I think it won't go away unless one of two things happen. One is we start to see tremendous improvement in the health of the Black community. Now, if that occurs, then the argument would be, well, no, we were right. This was the proper thing to do. So, as you've pointed out with your work with Jay Green, there's no evidence that that's going to happen. There's no evidence that having more Black physicians is going to improve the healthcare and the outcomes of Black communities. But, we'll see, because there will be more Black physicians trained, and we'll see how that all works out. The other thing that might do it is when we start to see a diminution in the quality of care that everybody else receives. And if we start to see that, again, that's very hard to measure. The outcomes of healthcare are complex. There are usually teams of people involved and institutions involved. But I think that's the other thing that might change it. In the meanwhile, there are a lot of physicians. We have now 15,000 members in Do No Harm. There are people that have started to say, I know we can't prove this, but logic tells us that if we start filling our ranks in medicine and healthcare with people that are less qualified than we could actually achieve by having a much more meritorious system, we're going to start to see a decline in quality. It's not an unreasonable assumption. It's the assumption that we've been operating under. And I think there are voices out there that are pushing this. We know there's been a bill passed in Congress, for example, that has taken part of our bill that we helped Congressman Murphy craft, which sought to, really eliminate DEI in medical education and to open up the books, if you will, so that we know what the basis for admission to medical school. Well, that's been expanded to include getting it clear that accreditation agencies would not, impose DEI activities on medical institutions. And it passed the House of Representatives. I don't know that it has much chance of getting through the Senate, but there's always the possibility that a legislative action could help in this and really diminish the power of the DEI enterprises in medical education.
I have one last question for you, Dr. Goldfarb, and then I'll let you and Ian have the last word here. And it's simply whether you are an optimist or a pessimist about all of this. I could imagine you answering this question either way. I know in our own jobs, Ian and I have 50 reasons each day to be both optimistic and pessimistic. You look around and you see how saturated all of these institutions are with DEI ideology. It's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel and any improvement on that front. On the other hand, we've got all sorts of providers coming to us, both publicly and anonymously, saying, we're with you. Everybody I know is with you. We want to break this monopoly. And so I hate to use the phrase, but it almost seems like there's a silent majority among providers, maybe a very vast majority on this topic who are with us. So I ask me, depending on the time of day, I'll tell you whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist on this front, but I'm curious how you'd answer this question.
I think that your approach is a very valid one. We had Yasha Monk on last year's set of podcasts, and he's written a very good book, The Identity Trap. And in it, he talks about solutions. And one of his points is it's just going to take a long, long time. Identity politics are here. They need to be disputed. I've lived long enough to see what was everybody expected would be reality was not reality at all. We had back in the 70s, we had young, wealthy people robbing banks and blowing up buildings and doing all sorts of terrorism. And that seems to have gone away. And it seemed like it was with us forever. So these kinds of trends that we're dealing with now, I think when they're shown to be empty of any real value, I think that'll make them go away. And I expect that that's what we're really going to find. So I would say I'm more optimistic than pessimistic. I'm a realist, though. It's going to be a long battle, and I think we're fighting the good fight. And I think that we've seen in other areas where there has been great success in business world, where they actually have something to measure. The old Kissinger remark about academic life, that the fighting is so fierce because there's so little at stake. But in the business world, there's a lot at stake, and there are measurable problems that occur when they waste a lot of money on DEI training, and it's all going away in business. So I suspect the same thing will happen in medicine. It'll be clear that the health of the Black community is not improving by all of these efforts, and that'll lead to a rejection of a good deal of it. But unfortunately, it's going to take time, and it's probably going to take a lot of money and wasted effort.
I'm going to put on my pessimist hat for the last question here. I agree with Scott that there's probably a silent majority on these issues. But leaving aside, I guess, DEI specifically, and even just looking more broadly to this issue of political activism embedded within medicine, how come we don't see more people from the inside speaking up? I mean, it does seem like a majority has to recognize that this is a bad idea, but I don't see it getting the kind of airtime that I would expect.
It's not the character of physicians for the most part to be like that. Really, I mean, the ones who end up in medical school, these are people that actually want to take care of sick patients. That's the vast majority. They don't want to be distracted by all this. There's the small group of very envious people, if you will, who are pushing their agenda. And there's another group of very guilty people that are accepting that envious agenda. The rest of them are sort of going along, saying, well, it's confined to there. It happens in medical school. I don't have to see it in my daily practice. I went to my primary care physician the other day. He told me about the 8 hours of trauma training that they have to go through about minorities and the trauma that they experience. They kind of shrug their shoulders, and that's the end of it. And then they go about their business of caring for people and trying to do the right thing. So I think that's a big part of it is they don't quite see the dangers. The dangers have not been clearly presented to them. That's part of what we're trying to do with Do No Harm. And the other part of it is, you're going to hold yourself up to some real criticism and some real blame. I have a fairly, if you go through my internet profile, it's kind of ugly, where I'm called every name under the sun because of these attitudes, just saying, look, this is the way I see things. If you tell me I'm wrong, fine, but I'm not doing it because of any malevolence to any group of people. I'm just doing it because this is my sense of reality here. And if they speak up, it's going to be a problem for them. But having said that, more and more people are speaking up, and hopefully we're going to see more and more success.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldfarb. We so appreciate your time today.
That was great to be with you guys.
Thank you. This is the Do No Harm podcast. I'm Ian Kingsbury with Scott Centorino. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to receive alerts when new episodes drop. And if you liked what you heard, share with your networks. Thanks for standing with us as we restore sanity to medicine.